All right, 3 weeks ago we talked about, when we were talking about the Bible, I said we could take a random thought about the Bible and I could prove it through Scripture. We had a studio audience member, Dave, come up and unrehearsed, he gave the false premise out of his head. He said, Jesus was married. Prove it in the Bible, Shawn. So here goes my attempt. Ready? Few people, this is my pitch. This is not true, by the way, so I hope they don't take this segment and use it as truth. Few people understand the importance and order of consistency in the Bible. What happens when is paramount to God and his awesome good news. Paul called Adam the first man, and he called Jesus Christ the last Adam, okay? Adam, the first man, Jesus Christ, the last Adam. Those are words Paul used. The first Adam was accompanied by a woman taken from his side, Eve, who introduced sin and death into this world by virtue of their rebellion. The last Adam, Jesus Christ, who through obedience overcame sin and death, and he introduced salvation. In the first Adam's case, sin and death were introduced to the world by a couple, Adam and Eve. There is inconsistency here if the last Adam didn't overcome sin and death and certainly face it with a spouse. There is significant symbolism and meaning in the fact that out of all the people who could come to meet Jesus, who were part of his ministry, from his apostles to all those who followed him, people he had healed, the first person was who? His own Eve, Mary Magdalene. I mean, it was Mary Magdalene who ran and even told Peter that the Lord had risen. Why? It was Mary Magdalene who reached out to touch him, but Jesus said, don't touch me, I haven't ascended to my Father yet. What was Mary Magdalene, the only woman there at the gravesite, doing there, wanting to go and hug Jesus? It was because Mary Magdalene was Jesus' wife. I mean, in order to be called a rabbi, which Jesus was in 2 places in the New Testament, didn't Jesus need to be married by rabbinic law? Yes, he did. Finally, we have another interesting twist to the idea that Jesus was married. He wasn't not only married, he was in all probability a polygamist. Evidence for this is found in his own teaching of the 10 virgins. Remember, in Matthew 25, there are 10 virgins coming to the wedding ceremony, and there is only how many bridegrooms? 1. Huh? Based on these oh-so-logical evidences, I think we can safely assume that Jesus was both married and do you see how bad it can go? Do you see how you can take anything you want, and if you just start talking about it and spinning it, it can be twisted and used, and you can prove something as ridiculous as that. Summarize without the facts, hypothecate with just a few sayings, and you can come up with a whole doctrine. Now, let me try to take you another way, okay? Could it be instead that Mary Magdalene was probably one of the most grateful people to the Lord, and therefore the most distraught over his death and absence? That she was there up at the earliest of the day, probably for 3 days straight, wandering around in hope and despair, maybe faithfully waiting for him to rise? Could it be that he had changed her life so much forever, casting out 7 devils that had inhabited her body, that she knew he was going to return? Could it have been that she possessed more faith than even the apostles, that she trusted in his promises and longed for his presence more than anyone else? Could it be that I simply made all this junk up this morning over a breakfast burrito? You know, this first couple, last couple garbage that I made up, tying Eve to Mary Magdalene? And do you realize that Jewish law, when it says actually in the Shulchan Aruch OH 581:1, that only one who is married may lead the congregation in worship, talking about a rabbi, but that the title of this rabbi is the Hazan Shaliah Tisber, and that title may not be the kind of non-married rabbi whose only function it is to teach. There's 2 types. One who had to be married, one whose sole function was to teach and didn't have to be. Anyone can take the Bible and by using their own imagination and their ability to influence others and implement partial truths, give meaning where there is none. Anyone, including Joseph Smith. May God forgive me for this example. And with that, let's have a prayer.